France, in the year of 1380, was a wounded empire, ravaged by the 100 Years' War, hollowed by famine and disease, and bled dry by a divided nobility. Its people whispered of curses, of demons roaming the land. But the true horror was not in the woods or under the earth, sat upon a throne. Charles VI of France was only 11 years old when the crown was thrust upon his head. His father, Charles V, had been a steady ruler, rare beacon of sanity in an age of chaos. But he died young, and with his death came the unraveling. The boy king, golden-haired and wide-eyed, was proclaimed Charles the Beloved. Yet those closest to the throne knew love was not protection, it was bait. The kingdom was not ruled by Charles himself, of course not at first. Instead, 4 of his uncles, all-powerful dukes, seized control. They drained the treasury, brokered self-serving alliances, and deepened the nation's suffering, all while hiding behind the child's innocence. Charles became a figurehead, paraded before the people to silence unrest, his youth weaponized to pacify and mislead. And in the silence of his chambers, as the court smiled and bowed, the young king listened to the shifting of walls, to the whispers of traitors, to the weight of a crown that was already far too heavy. He was crowned in Rheims Cathedral in 1380, surrounded by gold, incense, and solemn chants. But even on that sacred day, something felt off. Chroniclers noted a chill in the air, an ominous quiet beneath the hymns. A dove, released during the ceremony as a symbol of peace, failed to fly, falling limp at Charles' feet. An omen, they said, but none dared speak it aloud, because to question the crown was to court death. Asterisk, the France Charles inherited was not whole. It was fractured, not just by war with England, but by the rot within. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for decades, leaving the countryside burned, the treasury empty, and faith in the monarchy deeply eroded. Corruption festered at every level. The nobility grew fat off war profits, while the people starved. Towns were ransacked by unpaid soldiers. Entire regions were ruled not by kings, but by roaming bands of mercenaries, many of them French. The crown's reach was brittle, its laws were whispered more than obeyed. Religious tension only made the fractures deeper. The Great Schism had torn the Catholic Church in two, with rival popes excommunicating each other and demanding obedience. France backed the Avignon papacy, while England supported Rome. To the common people, it was proof even God's voice had been divided in this chaos. Charles VI began to rule in earnest around the age of 20. The regency had ended, but the damage was already done. His uncles, especially Philip the Bold of Burgundy, had entrenched themselves in power, reluctant to relinquish control to a young man they saw as weak. But Charles surprised them. At first, he ruled with promise. He reinstated loyal advisors who had served his father. He made symbolic gestures of peace. The people called him Charles the Well-Beloved. Again hope, flickering for the first time in years. But inside the court, cracks began to show. He suffered from chronic fevers, strange bouts of exhaustion, and episodes of rage. His doctors attributed it to stress or imbalance of the humors. But others weren't so sure. They whispered of sorcery, of poison in the bloodline, and behind it all, behind every mask of ceremony, a dark truth lingered. Charles' family tree was riddled with madness. His maternal grandfather had died babbling nonsense. His cousins saw demons in mirrors. The question was not if Charles would break, but when Charles would suddenly not recognize those closest to him. he would stop mid-sentence, staring into space as if someone was watching. Then came the voices. He would whisper to invisible courtiers, speak to dead kings, argue with no one at all in one incident. He refused to bathe or change his clothes for 5 months, claiming his body would shatter if touched. His skin, he insisted, was made of glass. The King of France, the most powerful man in the land, was now hiding from sunlight, afraid he would crack apart. The court tried to disguise the madness. His advisors called it melancholy. They kept him out of public view during episodes, sometimes locking him in his chambers. When he recovered days or even weeks later, he would recall nothing. And for a while, he would rule again, calm, rational, even kind. But those moments were growing shorter, and the episodes darker. On some nights, Charles would fly into violent frenzies, attacking anyone nearby. Servants learned to walk silently, heads bowed. Nobles began to fear invitations to private audiences. Even his beloved wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, began to keep her distance. The palace of St. Paul became a maze of secrets. Tapestries covered scratch marks on the walls. Blood was cleaned before dawn. Priests were called in not to preach, but to exorcise. And yet, the court carried on. They danced, they feasted, they lied. Because to admit the king was mad was to admit the realm was leaderless, and that truth was far more terrifying than any ghost. But truth has a way of slipping through cracks, even ones made of glass. And one day, in the depths of a forest, Charles would snap violently, irrevocably, dragging France into a nightmare from which it would not wake for generations. On January 28, 1393, a wedding celebration was held in the Hotel St. Paul, the royal residence in Paris. The occasion was festive. The remarriage of one of Isabeau, of Bavaria's ladies-in-waiting. Nobles arrived in extravagant costumes. Music, wine, and pageantry flowed through the halls like a spell. And yet, that night would be remembered not for love, but for horror, to entertain the guests. King Charles VI and 5 of his companions performed a grotesque masquerade called the Dance of the Wild Men. It was a popular entertainment to parody forest-dwelling demons, primitive savages, or perhaps something older and darker. They were sewn into costumes of flax and pitch, highly flammable material designed to make them appear beast-like, wild, and otherworldly. Their identities were hidden, their movements bestial. And then a torch was raised. Louis of Orleans, the king's own brother, entered late and drunkenly waved a torch too close. The fire caught instantly. Flames tore through the wild men like dry leaves. Screams filled the hall. One of the dancers ran to a wine vat and threw himself in. Others rolled on the floor. Engulfed. 4 of the 6 dancers burned alive. The stench of scorched flesh clung to the stone walls for days. The king survived only because a quick thinking noblewoman smothered him with her gown, burning her own hands to save him. But something inside Charles was left behind in those flames. The public was horrified. Rumors spread that the performance had been satanic or a punishment from God. Priests decried the court's immorality. The people began to murmur, was this justice? A warning? Charles, once their beloved monarch, had danced like a demon and watched his companions die in agony. And from that night onward, his madness deepened, and he was no longer just a sick man. He had become ... cursed. August 1392, just months after the inferno at the masquerade, King Charles VI set out for Brittany. His god brother, the Duke of Burgundy, had been implicated in an assassination attempt on one of Charles' close allies. The king, still recovering from fever, insisted on leading a military expedition to bring order. It was the middle of summer, but the air was unusually cold. The roads were dry and cracking. The king's entourage, made up of lords, knights, and royal guards, passed through the forest of Le Mans, a stretch of ancient, brooding woodland, where even birds seemed to fall silent. And then it happened. Without warning, Charles screamed. He turned on his knights and drew his sword. His eyes were wild, fixed, as if staring at something invisible and monstrous. He shouted that traitors surrounded him, that they were trying to kill him. And then he attacked. Before anyone could stop him, Charles struck down a royal attendant, slashing wildly at those who had served him since boyhood. One of the men died. Instantly, another lay bleeding under a tree, gasping for his last breath. The king kept swinging, eyes vacant, mouth foaming. It took several guards to wrestle him to the ground. Even then, he bit and clawed like a beast, shrieking that he was under a curse, that he had been betrayed by everyone, even the trees. They bound him in chains and rode back to Le Mans in silence. The court went into panic. The king's madness could no longer be hidden. The whispers became roars that he was possessed, that he had seen the devil in the woods, that God had withdrawn his blessing. But there was one truth no one dared speak aloud. The King of France had gone insane, and worse, he had killed his own. After the forest of Le Mans, Charles VI's condition could no longer be dismissed as exhaustion or fever. He descended into a pattern of lucid clarity, followed by stretches of unrelenting madness. His outbursts grew stranger, more terrifying, and increasingly public at times. He would forget his name more that he was king at all. He once refused to bathe or let anyone touch him, insisting again that his body was made of fragile glass. He ordered his clothes to be reinforced with iron rods sewn into the seams to prevent shattering. On other days, he wandered the palace, halls howling like an animal, dragging a broken sword behind him, convinced he was being hunted. Servants learned to vanish at the sound of his footsteps. Some claimed to hear him weeping alone for hours, whispering the names of dead knights and long-gone saints. But the most chilling symptom was this. Sometimes he believed he was already dead. He would speak to his courtiers from a throne of silence, insisting he was a ghost haunting his own body. He would stare into the hearth and murmur, "I am ash, I am dust. Why can I still feel fire?" The French court became a cage. Nobles fought for control behind closed doors. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, now took on official duties in her husband's name, though not without controversy. His uncles returned, their thirst for power reignited by his collapse. France's leadership was being puppeteered by ambition, not stability, and still, the king's mind unraveled chronicles from the time described courtiers fleeing from his presence, and ambassadors refusing audiences out of fear. Even foreign monarchs began to question whether France had a king at all. Only a shell draped in silk and madness. The crown hadn't fallen, it remained, but it no longer fit the head it adorned. Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, had arrived in Paris as a teenage bride, exotic, elegant, and carefully chosen to strengthen alliances. At first, the people loved her. She was seen as devoted, dutiful, and quiet. But in the vacuum left by Charles's madness, she became something else entirely. Necessity turned her from ornament to operator. With the king incapacitated, Isabeau began issuing decrees, managing state affairs. and most damning of forging alliances behind the backs of the royal uncles. This didn't go unnoticed. The nobility bristled. The people gossiped. A woman with power was unnatural, but a woman ruling in her mad husband's name was dangerous. And then came the most toxic rumor of all, that she was sleeping with Louis of Orleans, the king's own brother. Louis was charismatic, politically dangerously ambitious. He and Isabeau were often seen together, laughing in private chambers, speaking in hushed tones behind drawn curtains. Their closeness sparked outrage, especially from the Burgundian faction, who accused them not only of adultery, but of conspiring to control the monarchy. Was it love? Was it strategy? Was it survival? No one knows for certain, but the whispers spread quickly that Isabeau had betrayed her husband, her vows, and the crown itself. And all the while, Charles sat drooling on his throne, a king in title but a ghost in function. Even more scandalous, it was rumored that one of Isabeau's children, Charles, the Dauphin, was not the son of the king at all, but of Louis. That seed of suspicion would divide the royal family for generations, lay the groundwork for a civil war that would devour France from within. Because if the bloodline was impure, if the heir was not of royal blood, then the crown itself had been defiled, and some believed that only murder could purify it. On November 23, 1407, the streets of Paris ran red. Louis of Orleans, the king's younger brother, trusted advisor, rumored lover of the queen, and de facto ruler of France, was ambushed after leaving a visit with Queen Isabeau. As he rode through the narrow Rue Viel du Temple, he was dragged from his horse and hacked to death in the mud. Not once, not twice, over 30 times. His body was left mangled in the street, his blood soaking the stones. A message carved into flesh. The assassination had not been subtle, it had been theatrical. The order came from John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, and cousin to both Louis and the king. He didn't hide his guilt. In fact, he boasted about it. He claimed it was a tyrannicide, the just killing of a corrupt traitor who had bewitched the queen and ruled in the king's absence. But the motive ran deeper. This wasn't just revenge or rivalry, was a political decapitation. Louis had been the heartbeat of the Orleanist faction. Without him, the balance of power shifted sharply in Burgundy's favor. John stepped in to protect the Mad King, to guide the crown. But what he really did was plunge France into chaos. The murder split the royal court in two. The Armagnac supporters of Louis's family and the Burgundians, led by John, began a slow, brutal civil war that would consume the nation for the next 3 decades. Meanwhile, King Charles VI did nothing. He couldn't. He didn't even understand what had happened. In his rare, lucid moments, he would ask, "Where is my brother?" Then, only minutes later, forget he had ever asked. His mind had left the kingdom, and the kingdom had left him behind. All around the hollow throne, daggers flashed, alliances burned, and France bled, all because the king had lost himself, and because those who claimed to serve him were tearing each other apart. By the time Charles VI entered his final years, he was no longer a king. He was a relic, a fragile husk trapped in a broken mind, occasionally lucid but mostly lost in shadows. He would go days without speaking, then suddenly shout orders to long-dead generals. He mistook servants for assassins, called his sons by wrong names, and sometimes claimed to be Saint Louis himself. He was the Mad King, not just in name, but in every whispered prayer and fearful glance. His own children were taught to fear the man who once held them. Foreign dignitaries refused to enter the palace unless reassured that he was locked away. The worst part, no one wanted him dead, because his madness had become a tool. As long as Charles lived, power could be exercised in his name. Laws passed, treaties signed, wars waged. Each faction, Burgundians, Armagnacs, and later the English clung to the puppet as a symbol of legitimacy. They crowned his son, Dauphin. Then the English crowned their own puppet king, Henry VI, Charles' own grandson. France itself was being split in two, carved like meat between wolves, while Charles sat in the dark, whispering to phantoms. He died in 1422, after nearly 4 decades of rule, most of it from behind the veil of madness. No grand procession, no weeping crowds, just a broken man buried beneath a mountain of lies, betrayal, and war. France would never be the same. The 100 Years' War would rage on for decades. More, the monarchy would never fully recover its sacred glow. And Charles' legacy became something monstrous, cautionary tale, a curse, a shadow draped across centuries. Some said his madness was punishment. Others said it was divine intervention. But many believe the truth is far darker, that Charles VI was not cursed by God. He was destroyed by men, and the crown that once glorified him, it crushed him slowly, silently, without mercy.